I don't care what anyone believes. This twink is gonna have the most devastating lore bombs by the end of Genshin's story. But today's video is not about his lore, it's about his gameplay. Welcome to Unit 2.0, a new concept series where I take existing Genshin characters and rework their kits to either be stronger, less clunky, or more interesting. Today's episode will be our one and only tone-deaf bard, Grande. With a new series comes a new list of disclaimers. The general one being that I'm still human, so I might make mistakes with concept making. Correct me if there's any errors. More importantly, all of my videos are meant to be fun exercises to encourage either ideas or discussions. Feel free to share your own ideas or thoughts in the comments, but stay respectful to everyone. I also want to mention this other big disclaimer. Just because I choose a character to rework in the series, it doesn't always mean the unit sucks or that I hate them. Venti is a really good example of this. He's not only my favorite character in the whole game, but I'd argue he's one of the more balanced units in Genshin. But that doesn't mean I shouldn't be allowed to explore different avenues with his kit. Now, let's take a quick look at my guidelines when reworking a unit. Number 1, I make it a rule that they have to be the same element and weapon as they currently are. So no reworking Venti to be a sword user or something like that. This rule's probably gonna bite me in the ass when I cover a Xinyan rework because Sis desperately needs to be Electro. But it's fine, I'll make it work somehow. 2, the main scaling types should remain consistent to their current kit, or should feel thematically accurate. For example, Venti won't suddenly scale with defense, but someone like Ningguang could be reworked to use that stat because of Geo having thematic connections to it. 3, the main roles of a character's base kit should remain relatively consistent or thematically accurate. Venti is not a shielder, and he shouldn't be, but if I wanted to give him some, say, sub-healing potential, I feel like that would be fine, since music can heal and his power over the wind can rescue lost souls. He's not actually going to have any healing in this rework, this is just an example to explain what I mean by thematically accurate. Finally, if and when I showcase calculations, characters and weapons are level 90, while all the talents are level 8. Artifact subsets will not be included. Enemy defense and resistance, Constellations, and any external buffs will not be included unless I say so. If I do include defense or resistance, assume the enemy is level 100, and all base resistances are 10%. Alright, disclaimers and guidelines are done. As always, you can find these in the description, along with links to music and social media, as well as timestamps. Now we can finally talk about the Anemo Archon himself. So there are 3 main reasons why a character would be chosen for a rework. They're either underpowered, underused, boring, or a combination of the above. In Venti's case, I'd argue that he's underused, and honestly a little boring. To put it shortly, he's very situational. In situations where the enemy can get easily crowd controlled, Venti is incredibly oppressive. He can absolutely shred those chambers. Against larger enemies and bosses, his crowd control is basically void, so you're reliant on his damage output only. While his damage is still good, he just doesn't provide much else outside of CC and a bit of energy, so other units will be much better against boss content. While I agree his situational kit makes him balanced, I also feel that Archon should be a bit more impactful compared to your average 5-star. What my rework is hopefully going to do is make him more of a universal pick. Whether you're fighting a horde of enemies or a boss, you can feel like Venti will be a good option overall. Now I'm just going to be going down his kit and exploring changes or alternate ideas. Basic attacks? Nothing to change here. He's not really meant to be an on-field unit anyways, so I don't really see any reason to change it. His skill is going to have the most amount of major changes. Right now, he's the only Archon who doesn't have off-field damage potential through his skill, so adding something like this would be good. Here's how it'll work. Venti still has a press and hold, but we're changing the way the lift effect works. If you press it, it will just deal Anemo damage, but it cannot launch enemies. Depending on the enemy, it might briefly stagger them, but no more up and away. His hold, however... oh god, voice crack. His hold, however, remains the same. Light enemies can be lifted, and some medium enemies can be staggered. After using his press or hold, he will create a Cecilia wind funnel every 2.5 seconds, which are effectively the same wind currents he currently creates. This will follow a pattern. The first 2 are exactly like his press version, and we'll just call this the level 1 funnel. Meanwhile, the third is just like his hold, and it's a level 2 funnel. So in terms of power level, it's basically press, hold, and through a crowd control lens, it's no lift, big lift. With particle generation, we have this change. The cast will not generate any particles, but when his level 1 funnel hits, it generates 1 Anemo particle. Then, when his level 2 hits, he will create 2 particles. This means every 15 seconds, he's generating 8 Anemo particles. With his original kit, he would likely use his skill twice, resulting in 6 Anemo particles. This rework does create more on average, but Venti would likely be off-field while collecting most of them, meaning that his energy requirements will be slightly higher than usual. But this higher generation might actually make him a stronger battery in general, especially in a mono Anemo comp. The Cecilia wind funnel effect will stay active for 20 seconds. This makes it so that Venti has 100% uptime on his skill. To kind of make Venti's cooldowns feel more consistent, his hold cooldown is going to be 8 seconds instead of 15, and his press will still be 6. This change is also going to make it slightly easier to make his up currents in overworld exploration, and following standard ICD, he'll be able to swirl every hit. This change is intended to make Venti a little less situational. You can at least guarantee he'll be dealing consistent damage and swirling even when he's not using his burst. For Venti's burst, it'll mainly be a bunch of quality changes to help with consistency. I'll get the nerf out of the way. You know how light enemies can get lifted into the air and basically immobilized for 8 seconds? Yeah, that's not happening anymore. His burst will still have incredible suction, so you can continue to group enemies for AoE damage and swirling, but they can still attack you, and if they have special movement abilities, they can potentially escape. I don't expect this to be a massive nerf since it only affects the lighter enemies anyway. Medium and large foes are basically unaffected by this change. But since Venti now has more damage potential through his skill, this change to its burst will prevent him from being too oppressive in horde combat. To make it consistent with the new mechanic, the Vortex will now spawn on the ground instead of in the air. It'll feel a bit similar to Ruin Serpent's Vortex move. This change is also a nice quality of life for certain ground level abilities. Those attacks previously couldn't hit enemies floating in the air, but with this rework, now they can. Finally, we're adjusting a targeting system for his burst. Originally, Venti will always spawn the Vortex at a set distance from his location. This means that if you're too close to an enemy, you have a chance to completely miss, which decreases the damage and swirling output. The targeting change will be similar to Yoimiya's. Venti fires the arrow downward towards the nearest enemies, and the Vortex spawns directly on them. This allows you to have the best potential for its burst uptime. Everything else with the burst should stay the same. 20 hits over an 8-second duration, 60 cost burst, and a 15-second cooldown. And things like the pulling strength and ICD application rules are consistent. Now we can look at his A1 passive. I decided to make his actual A1 to become a base ability. It felt like such a weak passive since it was kind of situational and more of an exploration-based mechanic. I'm also going to move his current A4 to his new A1, just because I think it fits a bit better. For his new A4, I wanted to bring it in line with the other Archons. Every A4 passive has a pattern where a certain stat will boost their abilities. Out of every stat, I actually think he's more of an ER user. He ascends with ER, his signature weapon has ER, and he gives energy to his teammates and himself via his actual A4 passive. So, hooray for Raiden! She gets another friend in the category. Here's what I'm thinking. Every 1% of ER above 100% grants Venti the following bonuses. 1. He'll gain a 0.4% Anemo damage bonus. And 2. His elemental mastery will be increased by 1.6%. Venti has two distinct builds. One is an Anemo damage build, and the other is an EM swirl unit. Giving him some ER will boost both of these stats. I generally don't recommend stacking too much ER on him though, so don't try to use both an ER weapon and SAMs. Just pick one, get the rest through substats, and focus the other gear on a damage-based or EM main stat depending on your build. Finally, here's a proposed change to his exploration passive. His 15% gliding stamina bonus is fine, but fine is all it is. I wanted to give him something a lot more unique. After all, every Archon has some sort of quality of life change and exploration. Zhongli can insta-mine ore, Nahida can collect plants from a distance, Furina can walk on water, and Raiden can... The new passive works like this. When the party is not in combat, the upcurrent generated by his hold skill will have its lift distance increased by 500%. This passive does not work in domains, trounce domains, or the Spiral Abyss, which is just to say it's overworld exploration only. What this passive basically does is that it makes Venti the absolute best vertical explorer. Quite honestly, I don't like using Venti when I'm exploring certain areas. His hold cooldown is excessively long, and the distance at which I travel upwards doesn't even feel that high. So as long as you're in the overworld and you're out of combat, his upcurrent will send you much higher, and you can cast his skill more often. As I mentioned before, his hold cooldown will be reduced to 8 seconds. That'll be it for Venti's base kit. All in all, we're looking at higher damage and swirling, a more balanced way of enemy crowd control and stagger, some extra buffing, and exploration power creep. Now let's look at the damage calculations. I want to reiterate that my videos are concept over calculations, so this section is just there to give you a general idea and comparison of numbers, which can easily be adjusted for balancing reasons. In these calculations, I'm assuming the following. His level 1 funnel will be the same damage as his press, his level 2 funnel will be the same damage as his hold skill, The rest of his multipliers stay the same. His weapon is LG for the end, and he's using a 4-piece VV set. We're showing two different builds for this. One of them is an attack damage crit rate build, and the other is a full EM build. I assume he swirls every hit of his skill, so EM is also taken into consideration. And since swirling in groups deals an additional instance of swirl damage, we will have numbers showing for both fights against one enemy and two. For his skill damage on an ADC build, we're looking at a baseline at 130k on a single enemy and 150k in a group. For an EM build, it's 92k for a single and 125k for a group. These numbers do indicate that Venti has better output with a damage build instead of a swirl one, but regardless of his build, his overall damage is actually much better. And this means he's an excellent off-field DPS instead of a quick swap DPS. His burst doesn't really change in terms of mechanics, but it does benefit from his new A4. We also have to remember that he has a bunch of quality of life changes to his burst, so you're landing the max number of hits more often. Using the same notes of comparison, Venti's numbers are actually a bit more comparable between builds. ADC overtakes it by a bit, but in a group the damage would theoretically be the same. I believe it's because the damage multipliers of his burst aren't as high as his skill would be, so his EM sets are a bit more valuable there. Now for a weapon comparison. Elegy is the baseline that I consider to be a signature weapon. Its ER subset will synergize really well with Venti's rework, and he'll still be able to use the passive easily. But not everyone has Elegy, so others like to use Skyward Harp on Venti instead. I'm actually one of those people since I never felt the need to pull for the bow. So how do the numbers stack up? Surprisingly, they are almost identical. Skyward surpasses Elegy by only 1% without substats, but when you use Skyward, Venti's ER and EM will drop significantly, which is why Elegy would be much better for him. Now that we've looked at his numbers at base, we can look at his constellations. For the record, C3 and C5 will remain the same at increasing his burst and skill level by 3, respectively. So now we can take a look at his C1. Even in his current state, the triple arrows in his C1 are completely useless. We're keeping this one simple. Wind's Grand Ode will last for an additional 2 seconds, so instead of an 8-second duration, it's 10. This means Venti can lock in a total of 25 ticks of damage when he casts his burst, which would roughly be a 20% increase in his burst damage. His current C2 and C6 are going to be slightly merged and become the new C2. The new description says that enemies hit by Skyward Sonnet will have their Anemo and physical resistance decreased by 18% for 10 seconds. If Skyward Sonnet's attacks swirl an element, enemies will also have their corresponding resistance decreased by 12% for 10 seconds. Different elements will have individual durations, and this can trigger even when Venti is off-field. At this constellation, we just have good utility for resistance shred on every aspect. Since Anemo doesn't have as much resistance shred options, and physical can always use more buffs, I chose to make that value a bit higher than the elemental shred. Number-wise, we're looking at a 15% increase in DPS for Anemo damage, and a 5% increase for elemental damage. Keep in mind, this is already taken into account the VV shred. For C4, I'm going to remove it entirely. Since its new A4 grants him a damage percent bonus, this constellation would just be repetitive. So instead, we'll look at stamina, because that's something that's not explored as often. For 4 seconds after a Cecilia Wind Funnel hits an opponent, stamina consumption is reduced by 20%. Additionally, if a Wind Funnel triggers Swirl, 5 stamina is restored. With this constellation, we have more potential for dash cancels or charge attack combos, and a lower likelihood that the player will run out of stamina in the first place. This also slightly incentivizes running at least one party member that can allow for Swirl. With C6, this is going to unlock his full potential for damage. Wind Funnels deal additional damage, which scale with its attack multiplied by 25% of his ER, and Venti's swirl damage is increased by 40% of his ER. So with this constellation, ER becomes a bit more valuable on Venti, as it now boosts his damage by a substantial amount for both his talents and reactions. The ER scales in the same way that Arlecchino's Red Death bonus works, where a percentage of a stat gets converted as an additional attack multiplier for his base damage. Then for swirl damage, it works the same way as a regular damage percent bonus for reactions. It's still not recommended to run an ER Sand with an ER weapon, but the overall boost is very high. For his swirl damage on an EM build, you get an 18% increase. In an ADC build, it's increased by 27% with an attack Sands, and 33% with an ER Sands. For talent damage, his skill is increased by upwards of 50%, and his burst damage is increased by a whopping 227%. This is mainly because the lower multipliers get higher returns from the multiplier bonus. This next of the changes is a bunch of optional ones. These are ideas that didn't make it into the final rework because of either balancing or because it just didn't fit the rework as well. You could also consider these to be honorable mentions. Something small I considered for the first change was making a C1 part of his base kit, so a fully charged aim shot fires 2 additional arrows. I already changed his C1 so the multi-shot enchantment is just floating around now. Might as well be in the C0 kit for those DPS Venti mains. But for the second optional change, it's an addition to his burst. When Venti absorbs an element, the party gets an elemental damage bonus matching that element. This gives Venti a bit more buffing potential, and at level 8 this will be something like an 18% bonus, similar to how Ayato's burst grants a normal attack buff. The reason I chose not to include it in the final rework is because of balancing, but also because it steps on Kazuha's toes a bit. While the damage bonus is only around half of what Kazuha can provide, a pseudo form of this bonus combined with the crowd control of its burst can still be incredibly powerful. The third additional option is that his A1 now provides 15 energy to all Anemo units in addition to himself and teammates matching the absorbed element. This one didn't make the cut because in a mono Anemo team, these particles will be spawning left and right, so 15 energy might not be that useful. But it was considered when I looked at Madam 300 over there. The final thing I considered was adding a damage reduction multiplier based on the enemy's weight. The larger an enemy is, they take less CC, but more damage. And the lighter they are more susceptible to CC, but would be able to take less damage. It was one of the ways I considered balancing Venti's damage and CC, but I ultimately decided against it because the whole idea of my rework was to make him less reliable on enemy units. And this mechanic was effectively going against that mindset. Plus, I felt it was just too complicated and I didn't want to turn a skill description into an essay like some other characters. Now that I've covered literally everything about his kit and damage potential, we can explore some of his build and team options. Namely, what new options does he have and what current options are enhanced with this rework. For artifacts, he can now utilize elemental skill sets. He can use a 4-piece tenacity for an attack and shield buff, but he doesn't have HP scaling, making the 2-piece effect effectively worthless. He's already technically able to use Pale Flame, but this rework makes it easier to get both stacks. Still, Physical Venti is a meme build. If you play him like that, I have nothing but respect and concern for your choices. Deepwood and Dendro teams is an option if you need someone on the set, though I don't see Venti being super synergistic with the element. Finally, Golden Troop is excellent for a damage bonus, and this would basically be his best option in a mono Anemo team comp. Since the set is kind of an outlier compared to the others, here's a damage comparison when compared with VV. It's a 28% increase in personal damage, but you do lose out on the elemental shred. Just to add a point of discussion, I wanted to explore how a change to the VV set would work. What would happen if we changed VV to be similar to Deepwood? This means a 30% res shred instead of 40, an 8-second duration instead of 10, but you can trigger the shred while off field. Let me know whether you think this change would make the set stronger, weaker, or relatively balanced. For weapons, he doesn't necessarily have new options, but he does make use of his current ones a lot better. As mentioned earlier, his A4 rework makes him use the ER substat from Elegy a lot more. A 4-star option like Stringless also has more value since his skill damage output is a lot higher. Anyway, onto the last topic of this section, team comps. For the most part, his available teams don't really change. I'd argue the only change to his teams is that he contributes more damage and swirl potential due to the higher skill uptime and better burst targeting. So in, say, a Taser team, he can swirl Electro Charge a lot more consistently. He also performs a lot better in mono Anemo for the same reasons mentioned above. More skill hits and consistent burst targeting make him deal Anemo damage more often than he originally would. Alright, I think that'll do it for the first episode of Unit 2.0. As always, let's keep the discussion going in the comments. Let me know which of my ideas you liked, which ones you would consider changing, and any alternative ideas I didn't mention here. If you have a suggestion for a character I should cover next, please let me know as well. Please leave a like and subscribe to help support the channel. But with all that being said, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!